In the middle of the night in Los Angeles, Lewis breaks into a train yard and starts cutting through a chain-link fence. But before he can finish, a security guard shows up. Lewis quickly hides his tools and pretends to cooperate when the guard asks for his ID. Then, without much hesitation, Lewis knocks him down, takes his watch, and gets out of there. Later, he takes the stolen fence to a scrapyard and tries to sell it to the foreman. After negotiating for a while, Lewis suddenly asks if the foreman is hiring. Lewis gives him a long speech filled with corporate buzzwords, trying to make himself sound impressive. The foreman isn't interested, so Lewis lowers his expectations and asks for an unpaid internship just to gain some experience. The foreman immediately shuts that down too. He already knows Lewis is a thief and tells him he'll never hire someone like him. Later that night, Lewis is driving around when several police cars rush past him. Curious, he pulls over to see what's happening. There's been a serious car accident, and emergency crews are trying to deal with the situation. That's when Lewis notices a man named Joe and his employee recording everything with professional cameras. Lewis watches them closely. Once they're finished, he approaches Joe and asks what kind of work they're doing. Joe explains that they're freelance news photographers, often called stringers. Basically, whenever there's a major accident, crime, or emergency, they race to the scene, record footage, and sell it to whichever news station offers the best price. And apparently, all you really need is a camera and a police scanner. Lewis immediately becomes interested. He asks Joe if he's hiring, but Joe tells him no. The next morning, Lewis sees the accident footage on television, and that's when he realizes he may have found the perfect career for himself. Lewis heads to the beach and spots an unattended bicycle. He takes it, brings it to a pawn shop, and tries to negotiate the price. The owner refuses to budge, so Lewis comes up with another idea. Instead of cash, he asks for store credit. Eventually, he walks out with a basic camcorder and a police scanner. That night, Lewis starts listening to police transmissions around Los Angeles. The problem is, he doesn't understand most of the codes, so he begins studying them and figuring out the fastest routes around the city. His first attempt takes him to a routine arrest. The officers aren't interested in having him around and send him away. Next, he arrives at another incident involving an impaired driver. Again, the police shut him down, but Lewis doesn't give up. Eventually, he reaches a much more serious crime scene. This time, he manages to capture footage that is far more intense than anything he's recorded before. One of the officers gets angry and orders Lewis and another photographer away. The other photographer is furious because Lewis has basically ruined his chance to get the shot. Lewis doesn't care. Instead, he follows the man and listens to his phone conversations so he can learn exactly how these freelancers negotiate with television stations. Lewis is studying everything, not just how to record the news, but how to turn it into a business. Soon, he takes his footage to Channel 6 and meets the news director, Nina. Nina is immediately impressed by how close Lewis managed to get to the scene. She calls over the producer, Frank. Frank isn't nearly as excited. He argues that the footage is too disturbing for a morning broadcast, but Nina reminds him that she's the boss. They decide to use the footage with an appropriate warning. Lewis tries to negotiate a better price, but Nina doesn't give him nearly as much as he expected. Still, she tells him he has potential. There's just one problem. His camera isn't good enough. Lewis asks what kind of stories get the best ratings. Nina gives him an answer that completely changes the way he approaches the business. Viewers are especially interested in dramatic accidents and serious crimes, particularly when they happen in wealthy neighborhoods. Lewis takes that information very seriously. The next morning, he sees his footage playing on television. For the first time, Lewis feels like he's actually accomplished something. He records the broadcast onto his computer and begins building his own collection. Then he starts studying police codes so he can respond to calls faster. Lewis knows he needs help, so he interviews a young man named Rick. During the interview, Lewis once again talks like he's running a major corporation, but eventually he hires Rick because he knows the city, has a phone, and understands GPS. There's just one catch. It's an unpaid internship. Rick isn't happy about that because he's barely getting by. After a long conversation, Louis agrees to pay him $30 per night. That evening, Louis and Rick sit in the car, listening to the scanner. Louis uses the downtime to teach Rick the police codes. For hours, nothing happens. Then suddenly, they hear about a fire. Louis immediately takes off. Rick's job is to find the fastest route and guide him, but Louis drives aggressively because he desperately wants to beat everyone else to the scene. Rick gets nervous and accidentally gives him the wrong directions. By the time they arrive, the important footage is already gone. Joe even makes fun of Louis for showing up late. Louis takes his frustration out on Rick and demands better communication. Rick tells him to stop rushing him. The next time they get a promising call, Louis stays calm. They arrive in time. Unfortunately, the police have already secured the location and there doesn't seem to be anything useful to record. Most people would leave. Louis doesn't. He waits for an opportunity and secretly enters the property. Inside, he finds evidence of what happened and starts filming. But Louis doesn't simply record what he sees. He begins rearranging things to make the scene look more dramatic. He even takes private mail so he can learn the victims' names. Then he brings the footage back to Nina. She loves it. Frank, however, is horrified. It's obvious Louis crossed cross several boundaries to get the footage, but Nina decides to use it anyway, and that's when Louis realizes something important. The more extreme he becomes, the more valuable his footage is. From this point forward, Louis and Rick start becoming successful. Rick finds the fastest routes. Louis gets to the scenes before everyone else, and instead of worrying about whether something is appropriate, Louis focuses entirely on what will make the footage more valuable. Soon, he earns enough money to buy better equipment. He even gets a second camera for Rick so they can capture incidents from multiple angles. One night, they reach a serious car crash before the police. Louis starts recording immediately. He even moves around the scene looking for the most dramatic angle. When emergency crews arrive, he's forced to leave. Later, when Louis brings the footage to Nina, she notices something on his clothing that suggests he was extremely close to the scene, but Louis doesn't care. Instead, he asks Nina to dinner. She refuses at first, saying she doesn't want to mix business with her personal life. Louis makes it clear that their professional relationship could become complicated if she keeps turning him down. Nina eventually agrees to meet him. Meanwhile, Joe approaches Louis with an offer. Joe wants to expand his operation and asks Louis to join his team. Louis refuses. When Joe keeps pushing, Louis becomes threatening. Joe finally walks away, furious. Later, Louis meets Nina for dinner. He tells her directly that he wants their relationship to become personal. Nina rejects him again, but Louis has done his homework. He brings up ratings, audience numbers, and the station's declining performance. He points out that his footage has helped attract viewers. Then he reminds Nina that her contract is coming up for renewal. Louis makes it clear that he believes she needs him. Eventually, Nina gives in to his demands. Their relationship becomes part of the deal Louis is using to maintain control over the footage. But Louis's obsession with winning keeps growing. One night, Rick makes another routing mistake. This time, Joe's team reaches the biggest story first. Louis is furious. Later, he brings Nina footage from several smaller incidents. Nina completely loses her patience. Her rival station has the major story, and she knows her bosses won't be happy. Louis watches Joe's footage on television the next morning. He's so angry that he destroys the mirror in his bathroom. Now he wants revenge. That night, Louis and Rick respond to another crash. When they arrive, Louis realizes the vehicle belongs to Joe. Joe has been badly injured. Rick tells Louis they shouldn't record him because Joe is one of them. Louis doesn't care. He keeps filming. A few nights later, Louis and Rick arrive at a wealthy mansion shortly after a break-in. This time, Louis gets inside before the police arrive. He sees the suspects leaving and secretly records their faces and vehicle. Then he enters the house and discovers the aftermath of the crime. Louis records everything. He even focuses on an empty crib, deliberately creating suspense and making viewers wonder what happened there. Eventually, he finds a victim who is still alive. Instead of immediately helping, Louis keeps filming. Then he and Rick leave just before the police arrive. On the way out, Louis edits the footage so the suspects and the surviving victim aren't clearly identifiable. He brings the recording to Nina. She's impressed. Frank is horrified. So Nina calls the station's lawyer. The lawyer explains that they're entering dangerous legal territory, but with certain information hidden and the victims protected, the station may still be able to broadcast it. Louis asks for $15,000. Nina refuses. That's when Louis makes his position clear. He believes he has all the leverage. From now on, he wants the station to pay his asking price, give credit to his company, Video Production News, and introduce him to important people at the station. Nina reluctantly agrees. When the report finally airs, Louis watches proudly as the anchors mention his company. The broadcast becomes increasingly dramatic, with the presenters emphasizing the most frightening details. During the commercial break, Nina's bosses call. They're impressed. They want to meet Louis, but the police aren't impressed. The next morning, Detective Frontieri and her partner visit Louis. They question him about the crime at the mansion. Louis calmly gives them a carefully prepared story. He claims he heard the commotion, went inside to help, and started recording when he realized the situation was already beyond his control. He also claims he saw a vehicle leaving, but couldn't identify the people inside. The detectives don't believe him, but without enough evidence, they have no choice but to leave. Afterward, Louis searches for the vehicle's license plate online. He finds an address connected to one of the suspects. Louis and Rick go there and wait. Rick eventually realizes Louis isn't planning to call the police immediately. Louis explains his plan. He wants to follow the suspects until they reach a more dramatic location. Rick realizes just how dangerous this has become and demands a raise. Louis tells him to name his price. Rick says $75 per night. Louis agrees instantly. Rick immediately realizes he probably should have asked for more, but Louis tells him the deal is already done. Eventually, the suspect leaves the house. Louis and Rick follow him until he picks up another person. They continue following them until the two men stop at a fast food restaurant. That's when Louis finally calls the police. He gives them detailed information and tells them the suspects may be armed. He even gives the police his own name so he can take credit for finding them. Rick realizes there's a potential reward involved and asks Louis for half. Louis doesn't like the idea, but he agrees because he needs Rick's second camera. Rick takes his position across the street. A few moments later, the police arrive. The suspects try to escape, and the situation quickly turns chaotic. A confrontation breaks out. Louis and Rick keep recording everything. One suspect is taken out of the fight, while the other manages to escape in his vehicle. The police chase after him. Louis follows too. While driving, Louis keeps yelling at Rick to keep recording. The pursuit becomes increasingly dangerous. Vehicles collide, police cars are damaged, and eventually the suspect crashes. Louis immediately rushes toward the scene with his camera. He assumes the suspect is finished. Then he asks Rick to get closer and capture another angle. Rick approaches. Suddenly, the suspect is still conscious and fires at Rick. Louis doesn't react the way you'd expect. Instead, he keeps filming. The police arrive moments later and stop the suspect. Louis then checks on Rick, and Rick finally realizes something terrifying. Louis knew the suspect might still be alive. He deliberately sent Rick closer because he wanted a better shot. Louis shows almost no remorse. Instead, he takes Rick's camera. Then he heads back to the station with the footage. Nina is thrilled by what Louis captured, but before the report goes live, Frank reveals something important. A trusted source has told him that the mansion crime wasn't simply a random attack. The family may have had connections to organized crime and illegal activity. Frank wants the report to include that context. Nina refuses. She believes the story of ordinary people becoming victims will attract more viewers. Frank tells her she's starting to sound exactly like Louis. Nina doesn't see that as an insult. She actually takes it as a compliment. She says Louis has shown them how far they can go. Later, Detective Frontieri arrives at the station and demands the footage because it could be evidence. Nina refuses to hand it over without a warrant. The detective then takes Louis in for questioning. Louis remains completely calm. He repeats the same story. Frontieri becomes increasingly frustrated and confronts him about his reckless and unethical behavior. But without solid evidence connecting Louis to the crimes, she has to release him, and Louis walks away completely unfazed. A few nights later, Louis has expanded his operation. He now has 2 vans carrying the Video Production News logo. He hires 3 new interns. He doesn't plan on paying them. Instead, he promises that he won't ask them to do anything he wouldn't do himself. Then Louis and his new team head back into the streets of Los Angeles. Because for Louis, this isn't just a job anymore. It's an obsession, and he's only getting started.